Dear Dr. Phelps, you were the first to conduct a formal and realistic analysis of unemployment and inflation, where the role of inflationary expectations was taken seriously. You developed the expectations-augmented Phelps curve and examined how stabilization policy could be conducted in this setting. You also pioneered the analysis of labor markets where informational problems are pervasive. Your work on capital formation has helped us understand intergenerational economic conflicts and the important role of human capital in economic growth. It is an honor and a privilege to convey to you, on behalf of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, our warmest congratulations. I now ask you to receive your prize from His Majesty the King.
Edmund S. Phelps was awarded the 2006 Nobel Prize in Economic Science for his analysis of intertemporal trade-offs in macroeconomic policy. He focused on two distinct areas of macroeconomics: the trade-off between unemployment and inflation and capital accumulation and economic growth.
Since the 1930s, policymakers in many nations dealt with unemployment in the same way. They would let inflation increase to create jobs. For example, they would make credit easier to get. As a result, people would buy more goods. Businesses would hire workers to meet growing demand, forcing prices up. For many years, policymakers accepted that reducing unemployment required higher inflation. Mr. Phelps found that inflation did temporarily increase employment, but he discovered that over the long term, inflation hurt job creation. His ideas were proved by economic conditions in America in the 1970s. That period was known for stagflation, having high unemployment and high inflation at the same time. Edmund Phelps also found that if employers expect low inflation in the future, they are more likely to hire workers. Today, economic policy experts believe the best way to create jobs is to fight inflation.
On the vertical axis, we have wage inflation. You might see that some texts just write inflation. On the horizontal axis, we have unemployment. Let's imagine then that we start at 5% unemployment and 0% inflation. 5% is a little on the high side. William Beveridge in the 1940s thought that full employment should be around 3%, although this was a fairly arbitrary rate. Nevertheless, most governments would be happy with a 3% rate. Now we draw on the Phelps curve. This shows the inverse and non-linear trade-off between unemployment and inflation. If the government was of a Keynesian frame of mind, they would want to reduce this rate from 5% to 3% by using discretionary fiscal policy. That is, reducing taxation, increasing government expenditure, or both. By boosting aggregate demand, jobs are created and unemployment falls. We move up along the Phelps curve, but see that we now gain this at the expense of 2% inflation. Milton Friedman and Edmund Phelps thought the workers would suffer from money illusion and temporarily be fooled, but in the long run they'd adapt their expectations. After a while they would factor in the 2% inflation and demand higher wages, withdrawing their labour until they got it, so unemployment would then return to its old level of 5%. The trade-off between inflation and unemployment would still exist, but at a new baseline of 2% inflation, so we get a new Phelps curve that is upward and to the right of the old one. If the government again responds by raising government expenditure, they would again get unemployment down to 3%. However, we now move up the new Phelps curve and the reduction in unemployment is paid for with 6% inflation. Notice inflation has accelerated. Previously we gained the reduction in unemployment with 2% inflation, but now at 6% the rate has not only increased, but by more than 2%. Again, workers have been fooled by money illusion. But then once again, they adapt their expectations, withdrawing labour so unemployment reaches 5% and demanding higher wages. Friedman and Phelps are suggesting that whilst Keynesian demand management can reduce unemployment temporarily, this comes at the expense of not inflation, but accelerating inflation. Ultimately, unemployment falls back to its original rate, which they call the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or NIRU. The result is a long-run Phelps curve which is vertical, or what we call the expectations-augmented Phelps curve. Friedman and Phelps aren't saying that there's nothing we can do about unemployment, merely that demand-side policies won't work. If we want to reduce unemployment, we need to move the long-run Phelps curve to the left, with supply-side policies. But that's another topic.
Taking an intergenerational perspective, he posited that the goal is to attain the maximum consumption per capita that is sustainable in the long run. By reducing the savings rate, consumption can be increased immediately. If the original savings rate is above the golden rule level, this reduction also implies a long-run gain in consumption. Phelps concluded that savings can be too low if the current generation has a different valuation of its own consumption in relation to that of the next generation. In these circumstances, public measures in order to increase the savings of all generations can increase the welfare of all generations. Phelps also analyzed the role of investment in education, human capital, and research and development (R&D) in the growth process and shown that the golden rule can be generalized. Long-run consumption, R&D investments, which raise the technology level, should also be adjusted to the level where their return is equal to the growth rate in the economy. Phelps emphasized how a better educated workforce facilitates the dissemination of new technology, thereby making it easier for poorer countries to catch up with richer countries. This may explain why recent empirical research has found that GDP growth appears to depend on the existing stock of human capital, not just its growth rate. Implication of the research. 1. Banks now routinely base their interest rate decisions on assessments of the equilibrium unemployment rate and the trade-offs between the effects of policy at different horizons. 2. The interest of a firm is to set high wages in order to improve workers' morale, reduce labor turnover, and attract better qualified employees. 3. The savings of all generations, for example through a public pension system, can increase the welfare of all generations.